Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are on day 114 of Israel's war with the Gazan terrorists. The war is continuing on the ground in Gaza, with the IDF forces expanding their control in the northern Gaza Strip and also progressing into taking over Khan Yunis, constantly finding more and more tunnels, more and more munitions, more and more factories for creating new munitions, new rockets. And that's what they've been firing also over the last 48 hours. A few mortar shells have been fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel, into the southern area, to the area of Kisufim. That's really the update on the Gaza Strip and what's going on there. Hand-to-hand fighting, must be understood, with the last week, over 200 terrorists being killed. In the north, we've continued on with that war of attrition. Hezbollah keeps on attacking Israel, and Israel keeps on responding with more and more force. IDF forces saying over the weekend that we are now ready for an escalation of the war also with Hezbollah. That's something which is probably going to happen. Israel, as we recall, gave an ultimatum, said that we need to find a political solution by the end of January, and after that we will have to explore other avenues. So that's something which you have to carry on watching, and we'll be discussing a little bit later in the program and in our upcoming briefings. The Houthis are continuing on with their activities, interfering with the freedom of navigation around Bab el-Manda, around the Horn of Africa, and up into the Red Sea, and continued activities of the international coalition there, led by the US and the UK, acting and operating against the Houthis and their base of support and their base of terrorism. Today, just before we started the program, there was a new announcement by the Iranians that they had managed to take over an oil tanker with 2 million liters of solar that they said had been breaching some type of restrictions, sanctions that they'd imposed upon the rest of the world as well. In Judea and Samaria, we've seen the continuation of the terrorism building up. Terrorists constantly trying to carry out more and more terrorist attacks, with IDF forces operating also there with ever-growing, unfortunately, force as required by the threats. What we've seen really, and we can't obviously avoid discussing, on Friday, the decision handed down by the International Court of Justice on the complaint of South Africa, discussing its really outrageous complaint that Israel is committing a genocide. As Justice Barak wrote in his decision, it would be literally accusing Hevel of being murdered by Cain, and really inverting all type of reality. And that's what we're seeing there. Israel being accused of genocide, when really the genocidal actions were carried out by Hamas itself. That's something obviously that we'll need to watch, and we will discuss specifically in upcoming programs, understanding what actually went on there, what was the nature of the decision that was handed down. But really what we're going to be discussing today, just also with a little bit more focus, is the development of the decision of now 11 countries, also growing numbers, to cease their support, financial support for UNRWA, this UN organization that's devoted solely to the Palestine refugees, the Arab Palestine refugees, now 6 million in number, and finally the world coming to the understanding that this is a terrorist branch, members of UNRWA specifically participating in the October 7 massacre, others facilitating the massacre and the holding of hostages. For example, an UNRWA teacher who held one of the Israeli hostages for 50 days in his attic, and all types of other expressions of support for the massacre. UN Watch exposing a Telegram channel with over 3,000 UNRWA employees, where they celebrated and praised and glorified, really, the October 7 massacre. All of this coming out, and now 11 countries, the US, the UK, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and just most recently France, deciding to stop and to cease their donations, somewhere in the region of just about coming up to $700 million, which is about 60% of UNRWA's budget. So really a substantial hit. But what we're going to be discussing today with our special guest joining us on the program is Yaakov Katz. Yaakov Katz is a senior fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute, a former editor of the Jerusalem Post, and the author of Shadow Strike and Weapons Wizard. Yaakov, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I'll just add that Yaakov was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, not just the editor, and he did a wonderful job until he decided to go on write his second book and expand his horizons out into the world of policy as well as journalism beyond where he had been for a number of years. Yaakov, you were there were you 10 years?
I was about 8 years the editor of the paper, but overall about 18 years almost at the Jerusalem Post, with a short break in between. So a bit of a period. And
really, the cherry on the top of Yaakov, of all of Yaakov's writing at the Jerusalem Post, was the article he wrote with myself in 2007 when I took up the post as the head of the prosecution for AWOL soldiers many years ago.
That was a long time ago. Yes, that's true.
Yaakov, I think one of your greatest assets as an analyst is the global view and the security view you take, and that you combine together. And I think we in the title of today's discussion was Iran from Gaza to Tehran to South Africa, Johannesburg. Yeah, we're seeing here, which I think has gone underemphasized or unnoticed altogether, is the Iranians are engaging in this multi-dimensional warfare, which you wrote about actually in your first book, which is a combination of classic, what we call it, proxy terrorism, as well as the issue of perception warfare. Which is information warfare, which I think brings us to the ICJ. And I don't think that no serious discussion has taken place, as we've seen, that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice accusation brought by the government of South Africa and the underlying party, the African National Congress, is really, truthfully, an Iranian operation. I think there's a lot to suggest the Iranians are behind it. They're major financial partners of the highest levels of the South African government. We're working on that, on bringing that out to show people how extraordinarily cynical and mendacious the South African government has been behaving as malign actors and in service of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Your sense?
I mean, first of all, thank you very much for having me, Dan, Maurice. It's always good to be with you guys. I think one of the big misses of this war, or mistakes so far of this war, is the fact that the Iranians are literally getting away. There's no better way to say this. Are getting away with murder, right? Iran is stoking violence, creating chaos and bloodshed at an unprecedented level throughout the Middle East. In Yemen, where it operates, the Houthis, who are firing long-range ballistic missiles, have disrupted shipping lanes, have brought the Americans and the British to actually attack them, which is something that's a pretty remarkable feat to get the Biden administration take military action overseas. To have Hezbollah, which is engaged in a mini war. I think that we are already at the third Lebanon war. I don't think this is just clashes. This is a full war that we're fighting up north. So far, we're losing. We could talk about that in a moment. And of course, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And they are paying no price. The Iranians are able to do all this and get away with it. And that is going to come back to haunt the Western world, I fear, for decades to come. And you're starting to see already, we have the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is telling us of just how much uranium they've enriched already at over 60%, just how quickly they could break out to have a number of nuclear weapons with HEU, high enriched uranium at military grade levels. And you're starting to see their proxies in the Western media who are starting to write that for the U.S. already, there's no choice. They have to engage diplomatically with Iran. In other words, it's a defeatist attitude. The Iranians are winning and the world is lost. And there was a great opportunity, I think, after October 7th, and the opportunity to some extent still exists, but it would require of the world to do something that it hasn't been willing to do until now. And I'm not saying to even fire a single missile. What I'm saying is to present the Iranians with a credible military threat, that they have what to lose. because so far they feel that they have immunity and they have nothing to lose. And this ties in also to South Africa. In other words, if you are the Iranians, if you are Khamenei or one of the other Ayatollahs, and you're sitting in Tehran right now, you're rubbing your hands in glee because you're saying to yourself, it's working. I got the whole world focused on Israel and Hamas. I got everybody saying to Israel, be careful, don't kill so many civilians, even though our combatant to civilian death ratio is unprecedented.
Unprecedentedly
unprecedentedly low and remarkable in terms of warfare over the last century, and less. Even if we accept Hamas numbers for a moment, which I don't, but let's even run with that. So instead, the world's cracking the whip on us. We're being dragged before the Hague at the ICJ by South Africa, which is a proxy, as you said, Dan, of the Iranians. And I saw a report actually in the Jerusalem Post over the weekend that just shows how South African charities are being used to help fund Hamas. Iranian money is being flowing through there. This is a brilliant plan by the Iranians that so far is working, and the world needs to wake up.
It's unbelievable to see, really, that they're managing to pull all of the strings in every direction, cause that global chaos, as it were. And as you say, there's no price to pay. They've continued on doing everything that they want to do. How does that all connect in, Yaakov, to when the Biden administration started? They were talking about renewing the discussions on the JCPOA and really entering back into that agreement. That never came to fruition after, I assume, the Biden administration understood that there wasn't much to talk about. Then we saw the idea of broadening the Abraham Accords and bringing in Saudi Arabia as well. And suddenly for the Iranians, everything seemed to be falling into place. They are holding off the Americans. The sanctions that had been imposed as part of the weak JCPOA had now lapsed. Everything had lapsed. They managed to scuttle the broadening of the Abraham Accords, really at no price whatsoever.
Right. No, I think that, look, the Iranians earlier this, in 2023, to some extent, things were not looking great for them. Right. There was the Biden attempt in the beginning part of his term where the administration was very much pressured, almost, I would say, and pushing very hard to return to some version of the JCPOA, of the 2015 nuclear accord that was signed when Biden was the vice president and Barack Obama was the president. And that, without going too much into history, Donald Trump had pulled out of that. It had pretty much fallen apart. The Iranians had plowed ahead. We could talk about whether it was right or was wrong. It doesn't make a difference right now. But the Iranians were feeling the pressure. And the Biden administration, when they came in, they openly said, we want to go back. Right now, there was understanding also, and I think that Israel was having some success to an extent in convincing the Biden folks that an immediate return to the JCPOA as it was would be a mistake because so much has changed since then. The biggest problem was the fact that the sunset clause, which was going to go into effect 10 years after, was going to start going into effect gradually 10 years after the signing of the JCPOA in 2015, means that it's going to start to go into effect in 2025. So we're talking about 2022, 2023. That's around the corner. So what is even the purpose of going back to that deal? You have to do something that's longer and stronger. Those were the terms that were being used at the time. Was Israel going to get longer? Maybe. Was it going to get stronger? It started to look like probably not. It wasn't going to include any new aspects. But I think the Biden administration understood to some extent that it couldn't just go snap back to the same thing that was. Then we had the Saudi normalization talks that were on the table, and we were all in awe of the possibility and the prospect that the Saudis were going to normalize ties with Israel, even in absence of a peaceful resolution to the conflict with the Palestinians. Comes October 7th, and everything goes off the rails, except for one thing, and that is Iran's continued pursuit and accumulation of highly enriched uranium and creating more and more of the capabilities and the pieces that it requires as ingredients for nuclear weapons. So the Iranians are still on track, full throttle ahead, right? And therefore, right now, if we think about the prospect of diplomacy, what would happen right now, and I'm no great diplomatic negotiator, but I think it's obvious to us all, is that today, anyone who engages with the Iranians is going in as the underdog. The Iranians today have the stronger hand. And that's because they have been given it by the West, right? You know, there was a perfect moment in the beginning of this whole last 10, 12, 13 days now of the Gaza war and the conflict since October 7th, that when the Americans deployed their aircraft carrier strike groups, one was the Ford, was the first, it came to the Mediterranean, and then they sent the Eisenhower to the area of the Persian Gulf. They had an opportunity to send a message to the Iranians. The Americans had amassed here in this region probably the largest military buildup since the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. But they choked. They decided not to do anything. They decided not to go the extra step, which is, again, I'm not advocating attacking the Iranians just yet, but they need to be presented with a credible military threat. And for some reason, the Americans refused to do that. And unfortunately, we're seeing that play out now to some extent once again with this infatuation that the Americans have with the two-state solution, right? Every time you hear President Biden or Secretary Blinken or someone else talk about the conflict in Gaza, they always talk about how we have to leave the window open or the door open to the two-state solution. And again, what this does, I think, is I understand why they do it. Domestic politics, they got us, wink at their left-wing progressive flank. But on the other hand, what they're missing is that there is a reality here on the ground that they are creating myths and fairy tales and illusions that will never be realistic. And instead of dealing with reality, they're creating this belief in something that will only perpetuate the conflict longer than it needs to be.
Yaakov, it's a wonderful analysis on your part, and it leads to the type of assessment that you and I both heard, both having been at the same event in London just at the beginning of last week at the Conservative Friends of Israel, an event that you could not have choreographed to be more supportive of Israel, led by Prime Minister Sunak, who said at the time, in no uncertain terms, that the British government supports the destruction of, the defeat of the Hamas, the immediate unconditional return of the hostages, and then as an exclamation point on his declaration of unconditional support for Israel, the two-state solution, which is in a way an affirmation of what you've just said now. And I think that an additional point to the contextual assessment that you've just made is that the Iranian regime understands that fronting the Palestinian issue as that which the West is obsessed as the key driver of instability in the Middle East, meaning that the Iranian regime understands the American and Western, British and European misunderstanding that it's the Iranian regime that's the driver of instability in the Middle East. But the fact is that they have positive proof, beginning with the Obama administration, continuing with the Biden administration, that the West sees reality in completely opposite terms from what the Iranians know to be true, that they use that and therefore they corner Israel with this complete misunderstanding of this complete Western misunderstanding of the assessments of what's really going on in the Middle East. So it's a perfect Iranian regime storm that the Iranians keep advancing, and at the expense both of Israel and, in fact, ironically, of the Western alliance. Because if they put Israel here in the corner and they fronted here, look what they've done. They have myth turbocharged this two-state solution. What did you call it? Fantasy myth stories. And it's a perfect storm for them because it allows them to race to the nuclear finish line. It allows them to corner Israel on the international stage, including at the ICJ, including, on the issue of UNRWA, including with the Hamas committing our soldiers, and by the way, bringing out hostage family demonstrations against Israel's government, which is classic Islamic warfare. And there you have it, a perfect IRGC storm.
You know, first of all, you're 100% right that that event was pretty remarkable. To hear Prime Minister Sunak speak that way and very in unequivocal terms give that support for Israel. But of course, he has to play lip service again. He has to pay that lip service to the two-state solution. And I just want to present our viewers and listeners with an alternative reality for a moment. October 7th, you see, what people I think need to realize is that for the average Israeli, October 7th is a watershed moment, right? Because it shatters so many beliefs that we had as a nation. We believed, for example, we had governments that believed in the policy of containment. We know that that's not true. We believed that, to some extent, that good fences make good neighbors. We know that that's also not true. We thought that we could, you know, as long as we created Iron Dome and we had safe rooms and we had stronger Air Force. So yeah, if we saw them train and we saw them get rockets and they once in a while vented, that's okay. We can overcome. Same applied to our whole strategy and policy vis-a-vis Hezbollah, which we're seeing, you know, shatter also in front of our eyes. The whole way of our military service right now. We know that we don't have enough soldiers. We have to change that. That's going to have dramatic impact on Israeli society. The defense budget. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Now imagine if the world also woke up on October 8th and said, we also now know that what was can no longer be, right? That we had also had wrong policies and we didn't believe in things. I mean, you know, Dan and Morris, JCPA has been long at the forefront of writing, for example, for many years about the Jordan Valley, right? And the strategic importance of the Jordan Valley. Now, you both will remember how in 2013, under Barack Obama, there was a General Allen, who was the commander of forces in Afghanistan, who was appointed to be the security coordinator for those talks that Obama and Kerry were shepherding at the time between Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president. And Allen came up with this amazing plan, right? Israel could withdraw from the Jordan Valley because it'll get access to sensors and radars and drones. And the kicker was going to be early access to U.S. satellites to see if anyone was ever going to try to invade from the east, right? Because so our listeners understand, if Jordan, the fear isn't as long as Jordan is stable, but if Jordan falls, you have a direct line between Iran and Iraq through Jordan to the Jordan Valley to the mountains that are overlooking Jerusalem and the rest of the country. Can you imagine had we ever agreed to something like that? I mean, and then the question you have to ask yourself is, do you ever in anyone's mind, I think even maybe I'm exaggerating, but probably even the most left-wing Israeli today, after October 7th, would not buy into such a plan. But the Americans are still talking to us about a two-state solution. What if the world had woken up on October 8th and said, you know what? Reset time. This is not working. We have to think differently. There is a battle that needs to be waged against Islamic radical terrorism. Iran is at the top. Hamas is a proxy. Hezbollah is a proxy. These Houthi guys who I mean, I've known about them for years, but I joke about it because my kids, you know, they're like, at one point they say, you know, Dad, we knew about Hezbollah, we knew about Hamas. Who are these guys? Like, where'd they come from? But now we got them too. But what if the world had woken up and said, you know what? This is a new reality. And you know what? Also, I just want to say one last thing about the Houthis. Because so when do you see the British and the Americans actually take action? When it impacts them, when it impacts their shipping lines, right? The fact that Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles and that they're raining them down, some of them on their supposed closest ally in the Middle East. Now then you're not going to take action. You'll send an aircraft carrier. You'll give great speeches. And I don't want to underestimate. I think what the president did was remarkable to an extent. But when Hamas is attacking us, we're going to be told we have to do more to fall in line with humanitarian law. You know, can you imagine for a moment that after the attacks by Al-Qaeda in 9/11,
they'd ask for a state?
Well, yeah, but I'm saying something smaller. Osama bin Laden goes to Tora Bora, right? He goes into those caves on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan and is holed up in there. America's bombing and bombing and bombing those caves. And imagine if at some point someone had said, listen, you got to give them fuel. They need fuel for their generators, right? Does any American really think that America would have sent fuel to Tora Bora for Osama bin Laden? But we're expected to do that for Sinwar and Def and the leaders of Hamas. There is something abnormal here. And it has to be called out. Because while I appreciate greatly the U.S. support and the alliance that we have with America, and it's of such strategic and almost existential value, we cannot underestimate it. However, this double standard that Israel is held to is not normal, and it needs to be said. And instead of the world recognizing that something has changed here, we're still falling back into that same rhythm that we were before.
It's not even a double standard, Yaakov. It's a standard that's specifically set only for the Jewish state. No one else has ever been required to meet that standard. Imagine now if we had, on that same idea, imagine had Afghanistan tried to approach the International Court of Justice and say, well, those Americans are committing a genocide in Afghanistan after, or Iraq, Saddam Hussein going to the ICJ and saying, well, the Americans are committing a genocide in Iraq. All of these things would have been considered to be outrageous. And yet now we have an American appointed judge as the head of the ICJ saying, well, you know what South Africa is arguing based on the UN numbers that have whitewashed the Hamas terror numbers, well, that's a plausible basis for us. And that's something which doesn't seem to really bother anyone. It doesn't seem to affect anyone because it's setting that specific standard just for the Jewish state.
You know what's behind this? I mean, Yaakov very eloquently raises a key point here. And there is something very bizarre that is going on here that really defies logic. It defies history, and it plays into a question that one of our participants, Brian Gore, just asked this question. I think it's a question very well put, Brian. Brian's been a regular contributor and participant in many of our 114. We've had 100.
We're not 114. We had Shabbatot and Fridays. We're about 90. We're about 90.
We're about 90. But Brian asked the question, what prevents the West? And this is a question that plays in what Yaakov just said. What prevents the West from admitting that its fundamental strategic aperture assessment has been wrong, and to zoom out and to understand, as Yaakov said very well, that the root of the problem is the Iranian regime's race for regional supremacy under a proxy strategy and a nuclear umbrella. And I think the answer is, for the last 75 years, I would say, there has been a branded misunderstanding about the so-called Palestinian Arabs and the Israelis, where Chaim Weizmann in his day, not to delve too much into history, was basically branded as a colonialist, imperialist Jew with a British accent that was no different than the British trustees or custodians for what was called British Mandate Palestine. And Arafat brilliantly, beginning in 1964 with Ahmed Shukeri as the original CEO, the original chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, branded Israel as the way the United States had been branded vis-a-vis the Native Americans, otherwise at one point known as Indians, then known as Native Americans, which is that essentially there's an argument about a false argument about Palestinian indigeneity, which defies logic and defies any other understanding in this mistaken view that the Palestinians are the indigenous Native American, if you will, population of Palestine, that anything you say cannot be measured, compared in any way with any other refugee issue anywhere else in the world, and certainly not in the Middle East. And that anything, and that the claims of genocide against the white Israelis, as the argument goes, really brings people to understand that the International Court, ICJ decision is only the cherry on a cake that has been baked for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah.
And by the way, Israel has failed, as has the international Jewish leadership, to stand up to this completely bizarre, fantastically incorrect understanding that Israel really has no indigenous rights in the Middle East, so that it's very easy to call Israel a genocidal power when in fact its very legitimacy had been undermined from the first day of its reconstitution back in 1948. I think that's where we are today.
But I want to tell you something, Dan, on that point, and this is, when I think about October 7th and what happened, the blood, of course, boils. And that day, some of them tactical, some of them strategic. But really, when you think about it, we can be upset at a lot of different people. We could be upset at the world and the Americans and the Europeans and, of course, the Palestinians. But mostly I'm upset at ourselves, because we to a large extent did this to ourselves. By the way, I take blame and responsibility for my little role in not calling out enough from the platforms that I had at my disposal at the time to be able to say this is not normal. But I mean, in one of my books, Weapon Wizards, for example, I say this often now, I have a great chapter, amazing, about the development of Iron Dome and how it was pushed through, and it's a remarkable system. It's the one of a kind in the world to some extent, right? And the speed with which it was developed, and the bureaucratic red tape that had to be ripped down, and just how it was pushed from inception to operational capacity so quickly, and how amazing it's been updated and upgraded over time. But we never should have agreed to develop the system, because we live in a reality that we never should have accepted, that this other side has these weapons that they will use against us. And we covered ourselves in systems that made us believe that we can push this threat away and not have to deal with it head on. And that was our fault. So we are also responsible for doing this to ourselves. And I think that's what makes it, what makes this whole thing so humiliating to a large extent to Israel, is the fact that part of it is our fault, right? We saw the writing was on the wall. They told us what they were going to come do, and we said, nah, you're not going to do it. But then they did it. And I think that now the lesson really needs to be, and I hope that the lesson will be for us here in Israel, is that we will never allow that to happen again. But the lesson also needs to be for the world, is that they need to wake up and realize that this needs to change everything for them as well. And unfortunately, they're not there.
They're not there, Yaakov. You're absolutely right. Because at the end of the day, and this brings us to the pathway to the second head of this two-headed monster. One head is Hamas-Iran, the Hamas-Iran route. The other is the PA-PLO. This is PA-Fatah-PLO. And this is a very important discussion, because at the end of the day, what Israel did to itself 31 years ago in 1993 is that it koshered, it justified, it legitimized a self-declared revolutionary terror organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, and its head, the most renowned terrorist in the 20th century, Yasser Arafat, who essentially became known as the Che Guevara, the Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, all wrapped into one. And Israel played completely according to that script. And what has happened is, as you know very well, is that, and Maurice has been leading actually an initiative at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs that has also been envisioned and supported by Sandra Gerber, who is an extraordinary, someone extraordinary that we all work with, that the PA has incentivized through the Pay to Slay a terror initiative. They have incited to mass murder of Jews. They have also engaged in Soviet and Nazi conspiracy theories for decades. And Israel has lived with it, saying we can live with this. They invoked David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister's term, shmum, this notion that words don't matter that much as long as rockets and bombs and mortars are not blowing up in our faces. And in fact, it all blew up in our faces. To underscore what you, Yaakov, has said, on October the 7th, the PA, the Palestinian Authority that Israel helped create, is very much responsible for this pathway of incitement, incentivization to mass murder of Jews. And this also has to end. And that also brings us into discussion of the current law that is being currently considered in the Knesset of punitive damages for victims of Palestinian terror that has never happened before in Israel. So your comment on all this stuff, Yaakov, because it definitely fits in with what's happened with the Hamas.
I mean, look, you know, I agree with everything you just said, and I think that the big problem that we're doing now with the Palestinian Authority is that, on the one hand, see, we speak out of two sides of our mouth with them, right? We work with them. We say, yeah, they are the partner for us, let's say in the West Bank. They're the ones we do security coordination with. They're the ones who we look to as the side that one day we would negotiate a resolution to this conflict with. But then on the other hand, we say to the world, but we don't want them deploying in Gaza, right? And it's confusing. I get it. It's confusing to people. What I would prefer to hear from my leadership right now here in Israel is, what are the changes that I want to see happen within the Palestinian Authority? I know you guys have been doing a lot of work on this over the years. And you mentioned Sander Gerber as an example. Sander was pretty much the brains behind the Taylor Force Act that was passed in the United States, which withholds the funding for the Palestinian Authority to the extent or at the equivalence of the amount of money that they are giving under the pay for slay laws. These are the laws that the Palestinian Authority has on its books that pays to terrorists who murder Jews.
Actually, but Taylor Force is better than that, Yaakov. The original law passed under Barack Obama in 2015 said exactly that. We'll take off the amount that the PA pays to the terrorists. And what the Taylor Force did, and really that was Sanders' tremendous contribution, was to stop all of the direct U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority and to condition it on the abolition of the entire program, irrespective of how much they pay. If they pay $1, if they pay $500 million, they get no direct aid from the US unless they abolish that program, with one exception, obviously, the security aid, which continues to flow even though really the PA and the PA security forces are using that money to endanger people's lives, and they're training terrorists.
So thank you, Maurice, for the clarification. I appreciate it. But again, they have these laws on the books. They are inciting in their education system. We're hearing from soldiers in Gaza who are coming back. We're seeing the evidence of just what the extensive use of textbooks. We're hearing about UNRWA, all of their participation in this incitement foundation that exists throughout the Palestinian territories. Instead, so I would say there needs to be an extensive reform here that needs to take place. But to the question of the law that's on the table, that's trying to be passed through the Knesset, there is an opportunity now for the Israeli parliament to pass a law that would say also, this is enough. First of all, we have to do justice for the victims of terror. But also we have to send a message is that we will not tolerate this anymore. And this ties into what we spoke about before, is it really also starts with us to some extent. And of course, there's geopolitics and there's considerations, and we got to make good with the Americans and the European, we need everyone to like us. But at some point, we have to stand up and say, ad kan in Hebrew, right? Until here, no more, right? We have to, why are we not allowing our victims of terror to get the damages that they deserve as a result of terrorist attacks against them? Why is that being denied of them? We should pass that law. Is it going to hurt the Palestinian Authority? You have your people in the defense establishment who are crying, and I think so, that they're saying this could bring their downfall. Enough. We've heard these stories for too long. It's time to do what's right. Because for too long, we've been standing by and taking all these considerations, saying, no, well, we have to keep this in mind and that in mind, and look where it got us. It didn't work.
It's almost the same inversion of morality that we saw in the ICJ. Well, if we pass the law, then that will cause the financial downfall of the PA. That's not true. What's causing the financial downfall of the PA is the fact that they're using their money to incentivize and reward terrorism instead of educating people properly to peace. And so the Israeli law wouldn't be responsible for bankrupting the PA. What's responsible would just take the PA to task, saying,
yeah, no, it's so absurd.
Terrorism, you can compensate the victims of terrorism.
It's so absurd and infuriating because, again, I said it's the double standard, and Maurice, you said it's a special standard for Israel. And you're right, because again, I mean, let's go back to that Al-Qaeda model for a moment, right? Would anyone in their right mind have, if Al-Qaeda had laws that were paying their terrorists to murder Americans, and someone were to say, no, you should actually sit down and negotiate with these guys, even though they still have that law, and you should make peace with them, even though they still have that law. And then someone would say, no, but you know what? You don't understand, the prisoners in the Al-Qaeda system are really important in Al-Qaeda society. I mean, again, it's these some things are simple in life. This is one of those moments that is just very simple, and it should not be tolerated. And just like it didn't bring about the downfall of the Palestinian Authority when the Taylor Force Act was passed, if the Israeli Parliament, the Israeli Knesset passes this law for justice for terror victims, it won't bring about their downfall. As you said, Maurice, what brings about their downfall is the rampant corruption, is the fact that they are the most ineffective government system that exists in this world. And instead of the Americans and the Europeans to use the money that they're throwing at the Palestinians to leverage it in a positive direction for reform and change, they just keep on giving it to them. And that's the huge folly here.
And yet the law is very akin also to what you described as the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is a phenomenal invention. It helps us to really strike down missiles and rockets that are being fired at us by the terrorists in Gaza, and to save hundreds and possibly thousands of Israeli lives. An incredible invention that should never have been invented. We should never have tolerated the fact that anyone was shooting rockets at us in the first place. And similar, the law that comes to now do justice for the victims, it's exactly that. It's the Iron Dome. It's there to promote that idea of stopping the firing of the rockets, the payment of the salaries, the incentivizing of terror. And
Correct.
Yet it's also a law which should never have been invented. Israel should never have accepted in any way, shape, or form the fact that the PA, not only Israel, the world, should never have accepted that the PA has an institutional program to put a price on the heads of Jews. Go out and kill a Jew, and everything will be all right. You'll get rewarded. Imagine doing that same thing. God forbid, and definitely no one should understand it as anything other than just giving the example and stressing it. Imagine if Israel were to announce a program to, I don't know, kill Eskimos, and to pay money specifically for anyone who brings back the scalp of an that would be outrageous, and everyone would see it as being completely outrageous. But somehow for the Palestinian Authority, it's not only acceptable, well, you should continue, as you said, discussing and negotiating with them. They'll only kill you afterwards.
It's true. And, Israel is also under the false guise of what Israel calls the open tent idea about including in the discourse over Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Middle East issue as many Jewish organizations from every political stripe that you can imagine. What you have now are political organizations in the United States, like J Street, for example, that actively undermine Israel's position vis-a-vis these issues of pay for slay. You have people there in J Street actually totally ill-advised, misinformed, and insisting to the American government that the line item, which is basically called shahada, which is called, a martyr, the martyrs fund in the best of the Islamist tradition, is not a social security fund, as Jeremy Ben-Ami has said time and time again, and he's just dead wrong, and he misleads, and it completely undermines the case. But Israel never, and you guys have used the word no tolerance, Israel has never prosecuted a no tolerance policy for this type of PA Fatah PLO behavior. So that now we see tens of thousands of people in American cities and American campuses led by Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a Hamas, PFLP, DFLP, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, affiliate essentially, or cheerleader, leading this Jew hatred across campuses, and we have brought it on ourselves.
Yeah. And this is, listen, the one hope that I have a lot of hope, but one of the hopes that I have is that we won't slide back into that same place that we were beforehand, right? And I think that it starts here. It really does start here. We could blame a lot of the other places, a lot of other actors around the world, but it has to start first and foremost with us. And that is our responsibility. And let me commend you two on doing a fantastic job at JCPA and really getting the word out on these risks and on these important issues, because the world needs to be aware of it.
Absolutely, Yaakov. And thank you also for your moral clarity. I think both Maurice and our team at JCPA are really dedicated to what we call, and what you called, information. It's a tough word, but information operations, information warfare. We live in a new world where the original concept of Israel's, what used to be called Israel's PR, or Israel's hasbara, as people know the Hebrew word to explain Israel's position, which is essentially a defensive position that defends what had always been understood to be Israel as small, virtuous, punching above its weight. We now live in a world where everyone talks about influence.
We're Goliath and not David.
We've been repositioned since the 1982 First Lebanon War as Goliath, as right. CNN began to amplify. And now, since the advent of social networks, the word influencers comes up in the United States. And the whole concept of influence was really a Soviet idea about influence. And before that, it was a Nazi idea about influence and perception. So what we're the JCPA are trying to do is to counter that with the truth, and with getting the truth out and exposing the malign actors out there, and trying to do is what Yaakov Katz is talking, a whole reset. It's a really big haul. And yeah. I think in a way we're back in 1948 in terms of trying to re-legitimize, as Dr. Joel Fishman has talked about and written about for JCPA, re-legitimize Israel's case, as extraordinary as that need is.
That really is, Dan. If anyone tries to look it up, try and look up this question. When was the last time the UN made a positive decision on behalf of Israel? Right? We all know the exact date for that. You don't even have to go to your diaries. You don't have to go to Wikipedia. You don't have to go to Google. We all know that the last time the UN said anything positive about the Jewish state was on the 29th of November, 1947. Yaakov mentioned it, the petition plan. Since then, everything else has been on a downward spiral. Nothing else has positive has come out of it. And that has manifested itself into all of these organizations. Yaakov, a quick, we've unfortunately running out of time very, very quickly. We're actually overrun time. So just give us one quick, you said you've got many hopes, one quick message for moving forward. Where do we look? Do we look across the seas to the Biden administration? Do we look internally? Where should we focus our activities and really put the weight of our pressure to make that change?
Great question.
Look, I think that if we talk about the Palestinians for a moment, I think right now the big battle needs to be about the day after in Gaza. What will that look like? Who will be the players that will go into Gaza in our place? But really what we need to speak about also to a large extent, and we've been talking a bit about this, is the de-radicalization that needs to be tied to reconstruction. Because if we allow reconstruction without de-radicalization, we will have achieved pretty much nothing. It will go back to the way things were. The hope is when you look around the region, you see the Abraham Accords, you see, I would say that there were the most remarkable speeches that I heard since the beginning of this war. One was by President Biden with his don't speech very early on, I think it was October 11th, and where he called on the world and on Hezbollah, Iran, and anyone else who might have been thinking of doing something, don't. I have my criticism of that speech. He didn't mention the word Iran in that speech, but put that aside. But that was one. The second was about 2 weeks ago. The Saudi ambassador to the United Kingdom said that the Saudis are prepared to move ahead with normalization with Israel after this war, right? We see that that's still on the table. And what we have here is the alternative between the path towards normalization or the path towards destruction. There's one, that's the path by Iran. Normalization is the path that can be led by Israel and the Saudis. And the fact that the Saudis are still prepared to move ahead with us does show us that there's what the hope is here and how we can move forward. But we need the Americans to wake up and realize that the situation does need to change. So I think it's a combination of internal, but also making sure that we keep the Americans and try to get them in line and try to get them on board with what needs to happen here.
That's well said.
That's probably the exactly correct analysis and assessment, Yaakov. Amazingly, thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking your time to join us. And to our audience, you can carry on following us every day. We send out our link to to this briefing, both on our social media. You can link to and subscribe via the JCPA website to our YouTube channel and immediately join the briefings also from there. And also just you can see all of the briefings that we've started from the beginning of the war, really now 80, I think 88 in number, that all appear on our website. And you're all invited to go there and look through them. Really a tremendous array of different subjects that we've discussed all the way along. Thank you again for joining us. We will see you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time, very early on the West Coast, a little bit later on the East Coast. And thank you.